All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition for the AWD1111 ASP.NET with Web Databases class. I'm up to Chapter 16, as mentioned, how to use the list view and data pager controls. Okay, the list view control works a lot like a grid view that we talked about in Chapter 14, but it provides features that make it even more versatile than the grid view. For example, you can use the list view to insert rows into a data source. You can use it to display items from a data source in a more customized format. Oftentimes when you use this, you use it in conjunction with a data pager control to implement pagination. All right, so as far as our objectives, not many in here. This is kind of a short chapter. Describe the use of the templates when you're using a list view control. Describe the use of a data pager control. And explain what the before action and after action events are typically used for. Very similar to what we've seen before, where the before are used for data validation and the after are for database and other exceptions. All right, so let's get to it. All right, what you see on the screen here is a list view control that we can use to provide for updating the data in the categories table of the Halloween database. You can see here that the data is presented in a row and column format similar to what you had in a grid view. The main difference here is we've got the additional row that's on the bottom that we can use to insert a new row into the table. All right. If we take a look here, here are your basic properties of the list view control. Our old friend, the data source ID, which is the ID of the data source we're binding to. Our data key names, which are the names of the primary key fields separated by commas. And the insert item position, which is the location within the list view control where the insert item template will be rendered. You can specify here first item, last item, or none. In addition, there are a bunch of templates that are used by the list view control. The layout template for the layout of the control, the item template for each item, the item separator template, how you separate the individual items, the alternating items if you're using zebra striping, the edit item when the row is being edited, the insert item for inserting a row, the empty data when the data source is empty, the selected item when the row is selected, group template if you want to define a group layout, group separator template if you want to separate the groups, and empty item for empty items in the group. So again, the list view control displays data from a data source using templates. You can edit, delete, and insert. As far as the configuring of the list view, this is the picture that's shown on page 571. The easiest way to configure a list view control is using this Configure List View dialog box. Before you do this, you have to add the list view control to the page, and you also must bind it to a data source. Then you can use this, the configure list command, by clicking in the smart tag. All right. Once you do that, you can select a layout for the style and style for the control, and you can enable, as you can see over here, editing, inserting, deleting, and paging. The edit and insert items are generated regardless of whether the data source provides for editing and inserting and whether or not they're enabled. If you enable editing, an edit button is added to the item and alternating item templates that lets you switch to edit mode. If you enable deleting, a delete button is added. If you enable inserting, the insert item position property is added to the bottom, as we saw. And if you enable paging, a data pager control is going to be added. So again, this item template that's generated depends on what you've checked. Okay? As far as working with the layout template, the layout template that's generated, and this is on 572 and 573 in the book, it uses a grid layout that consists of a table with 2 rows and 1 column. The first row defines the layout of the data displayed in the control, and the second row defines the layout of the pager control if pagination has been enabled. One thing that you may or may not notice here is that this template contains a table, again, with 2 rows. The first for the layout of the table, the second for the layout of the pager area. And each element within the layout template has a run-at attribute set to server. It's not required, but it's added by default when you configure the control. As far as working with this, you use the item template to define how the items from a data source are displayed. In this particular example that you see right here, the item template that was generated, the first thing, ideally at least, that you notice here, sorry about that, so the first thing you should notice here is that this template contains a single TR item. So everything is put in one row. And that's necessary because the element that defines the item placeholder is a TR element. Then at runtime, the TR element in the item template is substituted for the TR element in the layout template. By default, the item template for a list view control with a grid layout contains 1 column for each column in the data source. In addition to an item template, an alternating item template is also generated when you configure a list view control. In this case, they're not using any Bootstrap, but I believe there's an example that we use Bootstrap later on in the chapter. May be mistaken, but I don't think that I am. All right. Okay. The figure here, this is figure 16.5 on page 577, and you can see that it's provided for sorting. So to sort the data in a list view control, you add a button in the layout template, and you set that button's command name property to sort. Not probably as difficult as it sounds because you're doing it in your ASPX code. If you want to sort by more than 1 column, you put them in a string and you separate them with a comma and a space. For sorting to work, the data source property must be set to dataset, which is the default. Remember, you cannot set it to data reader. And we saw this earlier with the grid view control. All right, and also like the grid view control, the list view data source doesn't actually do the sorting. Rather, it relies on the underlying data source to sort the data. That's why the data source mode must be set to the default of dataset and why you cannot set it to data reader. On pages 578 and 579, they basically show the same thing that we just looked at, but now rather than concentrating on sorting, we're concentrating on pagination. So you use the data pager control to do this. So to provide for paging, you add a data pager control to a list view control. Then you can select the enable paging option in the configure list dialog box. All right, and then you can set this up accordingly. You can set it up like this. You can have numbers with a numeric pager, etc. But this is what you're going to put in here. So notice first page and last page. So we've got that, and we've got our previous to next. Here, the page size All right. We're showing 4, it looks like, per page, and we're using numbers. As far as the properties of the data pager control, and this is 580 and 581 in the book, we've got page size, which specifies the number of items to be displayed on each page with a default of 10. We've seen that before. We've got the paged control ID, which is the ID of the list view control that the data pager control provides paging for. You only use that if the data pager control is placed outside of the list view control. Then we've got button type, where we can specify button, image, or link to show the type of buttons used. Show first page button that says whether or not the first page button is displayed, the default is false. Show previous button, which shows the previous page button, the default is true. Show next page button, which shows the next page button is displayed, and again, that's also true by default. And show last page. So by default, what you get are these two, previous and next. But if you add them, you can put in first and last as well. The properties of the numeric pager field control are button count, which are the maximum number of buttons to display, and button type, which are the type of buttons to display. Again, as we saw before with the button type for the properties of the next previous pager field, that these can be button, image, or link. All right, another feature of the list view control is its ability to group data so that it's displayed in 2 or more columns. So if you're working with a limited amount of real estate or screen area, and what you're showing is fairly narrow, you might decide to have more than one column. So in this figure, which is on page 583 in the book, this is the beginning of a list view control that groups product data into 2 columns. The easiest way to do this is to select the tile layout from the Configure List View dialog box. When you do that, the layout and group templates like this are going to be generated, and it's what you see here. Also, the code that's shown on page 583 in the book. Again, to determine the number of columns in the group, you set the group item count, which here is set to 2, to what number you want to set it to. All right. I'm late on time here, but I'm going to stop right here, and then we're going to go on and look at the product list application, which starts on page 584, and it runs through about through the next several pages, and then we'll do the list view. All right, so we really don't have much left in the chapter, but I do want to come back and do this over 2 lectures or 2 videos, so I'll be back with that one very shortly.